record.
Yeah, there we go. Emergency alert from the National Weather Service. So some sort of
Hurricane.
dangerous and life-threatening situation. So if you lose the data feed, that's why.
Is it from the hurricane?
Wizard of Oz thing where my house is blowing away. So, what was I saying? I was fiddling around with the quizzes for the course. Of course, you can need access to Canvas to see the quizzes, but for those of you who have access, they're there. What else did I do? I can't even remember. I got so many different things happening here. But I was fiddling with the stuff. Oh, I know. I sent you guys links to all the simulators that we use in the course. That was the thing. I knew I did something. So, at any rate, so we're trying to, tidy up the materials, and these things change course to course, and you're supposed to, I suppose, theoretically do everything I'm doing now. I should have done 3 weeks ago, but that's how it goes. But all the quizzes are there, and we'll try and I don't know. The simulators are self-explanatory. So any quizzes, it just says go to the simulator and do the stuff in the simulators. There's a few that are not that way, that involve model building, and those will have to, I guess I'll PDF them or something. Haven't gotten that far, but anyway, so that's happening. What else? Nothing of note other than that, I guess, is happening, other than severe weather warnings. So, like I say, if I lose the data feed, I'll try and restore things depending on whatever happens here. We've been having super weird weather. We had a very mild winter last winter, like super mild, and then a crazy Noah's Ark wet summer. Like it rains every other day, a lot, like sheet raining, which is weird. And then it was super hot for the last couple of weeks. When in September, it's usually not very hot out here in New England. It was like crazy hot. So, so now we got severe weather warning. So who knows? And it's hurricane season. Sometimes we get a hurricane coming up the coast that causes all sorts of interesting dynamics. What are you going to do about that? All right. So anyway, welcome back. Here we are. I believe we left off last time. I was chit-chatting about the world models and all that in my story. I'm getting somewhat near the end of my sweeping overview of our field. I probably need to share my screen, so it should say burn. Well, it says it on mine, and hopefully it says it on yours, right? And my slideshow was over here on the limits thing. And I think trying to remember, we made it all the way through the scenarios, right? I'm trying to just recall in this class.
Your history last time was so inspiring. I dug out my copy of Donella Meadows' book, Thinking in Systems, and decided it's worthy of a read again.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, she's a very good writer. But we saw all this stuff, right? I just want to make sure that I'm just trying to remember where, because when you teach the same class, different sections, and grad, undergrad, and they're starting at different time, I can't remember what I said to which group sometimes.
I believe we left off right after the world model. I know we got through that.
And then you talked about the World 2 model.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that was so but did I go through these scenarios, the World 3, the limits scenarios?
We did look at a couple models last time, a couple examples of it, of the different world models.
So okay, so we looked at World 1. Jay did that on the plane back from Bern, right? And then he turned it to that, and he wrote it up in a manuscript. for the Club of Rome, submitted it
Yep.
to a publication house, became an international bestseller, much to his surprise. It delighted and alarmed the Club of Rome, who paid for it, because they said, you know, we wanted to get attention to the world problematique, and we thought System Dynamics could help us do that, and it has, but it's like overwhelming the amount of attention. But you're one guy, and you did this thing in like a month. You modeled the world in a
Yeah.
month. And
And
go ahead.
Oh yeah, and I think like in the syllabus I think we got through all of that, and then based on my tracking we stopped at System Dynamics National Model.
Right. So my recollection is we went through the scenario, because then they did the follow-up study, because the Club of Rome said you really need a team. This has gotten so much attention. We want to redo it. Jay was busy with Urban Dynamics, Dennis and Donella, and the team did it. Here's the follow-up. One of the books, the famous book, The Limits to Growth, and then they have all the technical documentation and other books and things. And that leads us to, I think, did I mention Turner's stuff? There were a number of authors who in later years said, you know, how are we doing with this Limits to Growth stuff? So this guy is an Australian guy. I found a paper of his a couple of 3 years ago. And what he did was to say, let's get the limits original simulation runs, right? And then let's see, we have data now that they didn't have in the 70s. And let's get the data and see how we're doing. And then let's run the dotted lines are continuing to go forward. And his argument was that all the projections are spot on. And others have tried the same thing, the rational pessimist, whoever that is, Business Insider, they're all kind of do. Now, these are such aggregated, you know, I view this stuff with a grain of salt. And when we're simulating out to the year 2100, you got to take all this stuff with a grain of salt. I regard them as conversation starters that are interesting and worthy of chit chat. But to suggest that any of these things, like we know it's going to be right here in 2055 or something, and that's really not something I would put a lot of confidence in. The farther you go out into the future, the more more of a coin flip it is. But people have tried to sort of update it, like, how we doing? So this is probably where we left off, because I said I wanted to wrap it up. So where are we at today? Well, first of all, there's the Club of Rome is still around. They have a website, and if you want to go to it and see what they're up to, you can do that. There are competing organizations like the Club for Growth, which is a opposition group, if you will, to the Club of Rome. There is a movie about the limits to growth. It's called Last Call, and we can take a look at the trailer for that movie in just a minute here. And I would say, where is this stuff today? Well, I shouldn't say it. Here is Jay's book, World Dynamics, if you can see my cursor, right? And then that was so popular and alarming to the Club of Rome, they did the follow-up study, The Limits to Growth. And there were some other volumes that had all the technical documentation in them, not shown here. And then at the 20th anniversary of the Limits to Growth appearing, which appeared in 71, so this was 1991, the publishing house went to Dennis and said, why don't we re-release the book for its 20th anniversary? And Dennis said, I got a better idea. We have data that now that we didn't have 20 years ago. Why don't we redo the study and take a look at the model in light of new data, blah, 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 and rewrite the book. So they did that. And that came out in a book called Beyond the Limits. And that came out in 91. Now I visited at MIT from 90 to 92. And so I was there. They released the limits to growth at the Smithsonian. You'll see I don't know if you've ever been to Washington, D.C., and you've seen this, gone to the Smithsonian Institution. It's numerous buildings. And the Air and Space Museum is now out at Dulles and whatever. But on the mall, the original Smithsonian was the castle. It looks like a red castle. And it was released there. They had the press conference and all of that there, the limits to growth. I used to do consulting across the street at the Forrestal building for the Department of Energy, and nobody liked the cafeteria at the Department of Energy, so everybody walked across the street to the castle because they had a better restaurant for lunch. But so you'll see that. So the limits to growth was unveiled at the Smithsonian. Beyond the Limits was unveiled at MIT, and I was visiting, so I was invited to the unveiling, and it was in a giant auditorium, packed. On the one side of the room was system dynamics people and ecologists and what have you, and on the other side were the economists, because remember the fighting. Jay's first paper was a shot at the economists. They ignored it. Then Urban Dynamics came out, and that was mildly paid attention to by economists, more specialists in urban and regional economics. But World Dynamics and then Limits to Growth, that's macroeconomics. One of the two big, econ is divided into macro and micro broadly. So that's one of the biggies. And so that's when the economists really went to town on the system dynamicists. So Robert Solow, who is the father of macroeconomic growth theory, the modern version of it anyway, was one of the speakers at the unveiling. And Solow won the Nobel Prize for basically an economic growth model that grows exponentially forever. And it's taught everywhere. And he also did empirical work to support it and whatever. So, and so he was one of the speakers at when Beyond the Limits was unveiled. And so he stands up there and he says, and there's a Nobel laureate, right? He says, normally at one of these occasions when a colleague has published a book and I'm asked to say a few words, the first thing I say is, what a pleasure it is to be here. Unfortunately, this is not one of those occasions. And he went on to just rip the book, and the econ students would applaud whenever he'd make a point. Then Dennis gets up and does his retort, and the other side of the room is applauding, and the system dynamics people are applauding. So again, it's this economists and system dynamicists do not get along, do not agree, and are really hostile towards one another. Sidebar, ironically, Jay had 3 children. One of them, the oldest, Nathan, decided to do a PhD in system dynamics and economics at MIT, which he did do. And when he went to select a dissertation director, he selected, Jay and his family lived in Concord, Mass., a suburb of Boston. He selected an MIT economics professor that happened to be his neighbor in Concord. And actually, when he was younger, Nathan used to babysit for this professor's kids. So he did a system dynamics and economics dissertation, and the supervisor was Robert Solow.
Wow.
So yeah, it's an interesting thing. He said, Bob didn't hold what my dad did against me. So, which is the right answer. And Solow was known, he was involved in a lot of economic controversies. There was a 20 or more year controversy called the Cambridge Capital Controversies. Cambridge, UK, University of Cambridge, UK against MIT, Cambridge, USA, and it was bitter and went back and forth. And Solow was particularly known for his biting wit when he would write over the 20-year span about that controversy. So Solow, again, you got to bring your A game when you would debate him. He's still around. He's probably 95 or 90, 98 now. He's quite elderly, but he's still around. So at any rate, and then 10 years later, they came out with another one, the Limits to Growth, the 30th year report or whatever that says. I can't remember what that one was titled. And now Jorgen Randers he was one of the team members with Dennis. He was, he's running around trying to, he's building a macro model with some economists where they're trying to show how you can address the issues of the limits to growth without destroying the economy. So you'll see Jorgen in the film clip here in a minute. He's got a very heavy Norwegian accent. He's a great guy. He's a funny guy. So you'll see him in a minute here. And then today, where's all this lineage of thinking? Where's it gone? Well, it's climate interactive. Now the world models have kind of morphed into climate change modeling. And Climate Interactive is, you may or may not have heard of them. We can check their website out here in a minute. It's all, people don't know it really, but it's all system dynamics modeling. So let's just check a few of these. I don't know, the PowerPoint's always finicky here. Let me see if I can get to, yeah, so just, what is this like? Google Chrome always, okay. So this will be the Club of Rome. Okay, so the Club of Rome is still around, is my point. This is Aurelio Peccei's organization. And let's see, we got to go to, I click on it and nothing happens. So that's weird. So we'll go over here. We want to go to, there's a variety of these, sorry, I keep clicking and nothing's happening. There's a variety of these sites. Oh, here we go. That's weird data closings. That have clips from the movie trailer. Did I tell you the story of Jay and getting the pile of mail and the opera? Did I tell you that? Okay, so so one day I'm in Jay's office, and he had his inner sanctum where he had all the filing cabinets with the D memos and the days when they were paper copies and administrative assistants and assistant professors. And then he had his office in the back of that area, but his office was first a giant conference room. And then the back of that was literally his office. And so I was talking to him about whatever. And Nan Lux, his administrative assistant, comes in, says, Jay, the mail's here. And she brings in this giant pile of mail, puts it on the conference table. So I'm talking to Jay about whatever it was. And he's like flipping through the mail. And he goes, oh, look at this. And he opens it up, and it's a book manuscript from some guy wherever that he's never heard of. And he said, Dear Professor Forster, please read this and get back to me, essentially. Forster's like, I've never heard of this guy before. And he sends me a book man. I'm just supposed to read it. And, and I said, oh, get mail like this every day? And I was kind of making a joke. And he goes, yes. And I go, oh. I said, what's the weirdest thing you ever got? And he goes, oh. He goes, one time, a movie reel arrives from Germany. And he goes, apparently after World Dynamics came out, some guy in Germany was so moved by the book that he wrote and starred in an opera about World Dynamics and filmed himself singing the whole opera. And Jason, I don't understand German, so I don't know what he was singing about. But he goes, at one point he was all in despair. So he said he was assuming that there was the collapse of the socioeconomic system or something. So the movie clip I'm about to show you is not that. It's a different one. This is about the limits to growth, the follow-up site. So this is kind of the synopsis trailer or whatever you want to call it. But it's quite good. It kind of sums up things. So let's take a look at this. Now I'm going to have to unshare and then share again because PowerPoint is persnickety about this. So I have to, let's see, share my screen, but I have to share sound, I guess is what has to happen. It must be over here. Okay. And then again, I got to find PowerPoint. This is so clunky, man, to do this. Where do we go?
Because it's embedded in your PowerPoint.
Yeah, I guess so. I'm not entirely sure why there's all these There's probably an easier way to do it, I suppose, but whatever. So let's see if we can watch this clip here.
Have you considered going solar in Massachusetts,
Oh,
but
hang-
afraid of the huge price tag attached? Most people don't.
I guess this is it. It's going to give us an ad first, skip ads. There we go.
Once upon a time, there was a man who invented chess. The king was so pleased, he offered the man a reward. The man, who was very wise, told the king that he would only want 1 grain of wheat for the first square of the chessboard, 2 for the second, 4 for the third, and so on, doubling the amount for each square of the chessboard. The king said yes, and at the end of the game he had to abdicate, because he had no more grains of wheat to pay his debt. That is the nature of exponential growth, and our chessboard is planet Earth. 40 years ago, a report by a team of scientists from the MIT shook the world. They designed and ran the first global computer model ever, suggesting humanity should adapt to the physical limitations of planet Earth in order to avoid overshoot and collapse.
During the last year, a group of us at MIT have been looking at exponential growth of our global social and economic system. We've been led to 5 basic conclusions. There are physical limits to growth, which, given current trends, are very likely to be encountered even during the lifetime of our children.
This growth is going to stop. It must stop, and it will stop.
Second, the most likely outcome of running into these limits, if we continue to ignore them, is that we'll overshoot those limits and collapse.
I think that many people have found a new way of making fools of themselves in not recognizing that there are limits to human expansion.
We appear to have a viable alternative to this outcome, one in which population and material production could be brought into balance with the finite environment and with our resources.
We have learned that more is not necessarily better. That even our great nation has its recognized limits.
Fourth conclusion is that it's realistically going to take 50, 100 years or more to reach that alternative in an orderly fashion.
We believe then and now there are no limits to growth and human progress when men and women are free to follow their dreams.
And finally, every year we delay decreases our ultimate options.
Their report was published in a book entitled The Limits to Growth, which turned out to be the most controversial environmentalist bestseller of all time.
There can be no doubt what one subject has aroused most controversy among scientists during the past 12 months. I mean, of course, the prospect of doom for mankind because of pollution, overpopulation, overuse of resources.
Well, I think that the conclusions of this study are completely wrong. If you check what happens if you vary all your assumptions together, then I understand from the Science Policy Research Unit at Sussex, who have actually been checking your model, the catastrophe disappears altogether.
That's interesting. I spent all last Friday down with the Science Policy Research Institute, and they didn't indicate that.
Well, you know, this is developing debate who spoke to them last. I spoke to them this morning.
After having spent 40 years fighting for their message, the authors gathered where the Limits to Growth saga began. Which options do they think we have today?
40 years ago, it was still theoretically possible to slow things down and come to an equilibrium. Now that's no longer possible. We are coming into a period of uncontrolled decline. We need now to start focusing specifically on the issue of resilience. If we go through this period of decline without foreknowledge, without preparation, I fear that it will strip away many of our fundamental values.
The need is for early and strong action to avoid the problems that are already here and that will get worse in the future. The horrible fact is that democracy and capitalism will not solve those problems. We do need a fundamental paradigm shift in the area of governance. So it's the national and international governance thing, which is what one ought to be debating when one is looking ahead.
Personally, I'm an optimist. Personally, I believe in the brilliance of human beings. The past 40 years makes you doubt it a little, but I do believe humans are brilliant.
I don't consider myself any better than any other human being, but I have lived for 20 years with these global models. And I can see, I instinctively understand the global results of personal actions that I take. And I know what kind of world I want to live in. I don't want to live in a collapsing world. I don't want to live in a world, as Jürgen says, that's getting grayer and grayer. And it costs more and more and more to maintain even a decent standard of living. I want to live in a sustainable world where there is no poverty, no hunger, and no erosion of the Earth's resources.
According to the Limits to Growth authors, the environmental and economic crisis we are going through are part of the same global crisis. They don't hold the truth, and they have different views on the future, but we should listen to them for the sake of new generations.
Okay, so there's that. And then, like I said, in the lineage of these models and such, Climate Interactive is kind of the latest. What's happening here? Some reason it's going to my other monitor here. Let me pull it over here. And it says page not found. Let's just go to Climate Interactive. What happens here? All right. So if you want the latest, greatest models in the lineage, system dynamics models in the lineage of the limits and world dynamics, whatever, it's really climate change models. And so Climate Interactive, this is primarily Tom Fiddaman and John Thurman, and then some of their students and whatever that, and they're using Vensim here, sorry. But they have a whole thing with training, workshops and game simulators and whatever. And you can download the stuff for free and run your own simulations and what have you. And, you know, there are a lot of climate change models out there, but these get some attention in the media and what have you. So if you're so inclined, you can take a look at the latest, greatest, you know, ideas in this lineage. Yes, Ashley, I see your digital hand is.
Yes. So I just had a couple questions on that. So from the clip in the video, you know, they talked a lot about how this decline was imminent. And it looked like it was probably about 20 years ago or so, at least, you know, couple decades there. So how has that model stood up to the reality of what has happened since they made it?
Well, that's what these guys over, hang on. I think you have to select it. Yeah, that's what these people are all trying to do, right? They have, you know, observed data, you know, and then the projections going forward. And this is what, you know, when they did the study, it's over here. And here's the data that we have now that they didn't have. And then here's where it's headed. And they're saying, ooh, look at, we're spot on, you know, the model's spot on. And there's various authors who've tried to do this. Again, I don't know where they get their data from. You know, so I'm always a little bit, it's always good to be skeptical. That doesn't mean they're wrong. It just is like, you know, I'd want to fact check it. But on the other hand, I can't imagine that these are just crazy people, right? They've probably done some digging here. So the collapse usually in most of the scenarios is around 2050 or so out here.
Okay.
It's not an exact forecast, right? It's really a behavior mode. It's an overshoot and collapse behavior mode, not a predictor that on this date, like the Mayan calendar was what, 2012? They even made a movie out of it where everything was supposed to, they give you a precise date, you know? So it's not that. Dennis, if you saw in the clip, he thinks we're past the point of stopping the collapse. So now he advocates redesigning the airplane, redesigning the system so it's resilient. And so instead of, if it goes down, it goes back up right away, rather than it goes down and only gradually it gets better. Sturman would always say, yeah, if you're driving down the highway at 100 miles an hour and heading towards a hairpin turn where there's a cliff, at some point you can stand on the brakes and you're going over the cliff. You've waited too long to address the problem, slowing down in that example. Okay. Najla, yeah.
Just really briefly, I know that this isn't the topic of the whole this week, but how do they define resilient? Is it defined in terms of what is it defined in terms of?
So it would be negative feedback loops that would bring the system back up to where it was fairly quickly, as opposed to it gets. So think of a beach ball in a swimming pool, and you hold it below the water surface. You take your hand away, and it pops right back up, as opposed to you hold it under and it sinks, or it only gradually over decades creeps back up to where it was. So you'd want a system
in the sense that once it starts to collapse, it can recover eventually.
Yeah, a quick recovery. So those are negative feedback processes that would cause that. But you can have negative feedback processes that are creating policy resistance and holding the system in a bad state, right? Or you could have negative feedback processes that stabilize the system in a good way, right? So if it gets pushed down, it comes. So it's the airplane is flying along, getting battered by wind and rain and stuff, and you can still drink your coffee because you're not getting thrown all about. The negative loops, the servos are keeping things fairly stable. It's still a little bumpy. It's not like it's absolutely bumpyless, no bumps, but it's you're not getting thrown. Your coffee's not going on the ceiling of the plane and all over the place, right? You can still sip your coffee, and the system is handling the shocks to the system, right? So the question is, how do you redesign? Where do you put in those negative loops in this case? And then, how do you pull it off in the real world? Right now, there's some of that stuff is in the real world. You have automatic stabilizers in the macro economy, like unemployment insurance is an automatic stabilizer. It kicks in when there's a lot of involuntary unemployment, and when people are employed, they don't get unemployment insurance. So the economy doesn't fall as far as it would otherwise be the case without that program. So, and there are buffer stock programs, like the Department of Agriculture props up milk prices and cheese prices and stuff like that by buying when it's low and the farmers don't get a good price. So it props up the price and then releasing it into the marketplace when there's a shortage, or the strategic oil reserve. So any of that would be a buffer stock negative feedback loop system in the real world that was a policy thing installed to try and stabilize a big system, right? So it would be stuff like that would have to be put into place to create a resilient system. What you don't want to do is stabilize it at a crummy state where you can't get out. Right, therein lies some of the tricky business. Okay.
So is this model telling me I need to take my retirement out of investments and put it in gold?
Well,
that's what it looks like right now.
Yeah, and then have your secret survival garden in the woods, next to your bug out shack and all that. I don't know. It's well, we're going to get into the debate because a lot of people do not agree with this analysis, so including most of the economics profession. So we can maybe answer that by, let me push on a little bit, because and then we don't know the future. I mean, these models, none of these models can predict the creation of the blockchain and Bitcoin. It's not like you run a system dynamics model and it discovers some technology like that, or the cure for cancer, or the latest great, some AI thing, or what, if it's not in your mental model and you don't put it into the structure of the system dynamics model, it's just not there. So we don't know who's going to discover what. But 5 years from now, 10 years from now, next year, for all we know, right? So therein lies, well, we'll get to what the counter argument is here in just a minute. All right, so, and if you want to see the Club for Growth or the opposition, so the debate is ongoing. Now, when you get to the World Dynamics, the World 2 simulator, one of the things you're gonna be able to test is Boyd's policy. And he pointed out to Jay that there was no explicit technological change in his model. And he said, when I put in technological change, looky what happens to your model. And it cures a lot of the problems, at least under certain scenarios. So you can play around with that. But the debate, it has been said, boils down to the neo-Malthusians versus the technological optimists. So remember, Malthus was the reverend economist at Cambridge University who said populations grow exponentially and food grows linearly. And therefore, the gap is going to increase. The demand is going to way outstrip the supply, and all sorts of famine and pestilence and whatever is going to happen. He was writing that in the 1800s. So they've said Forrester's just a modern day, and Meadows is modern day Malthus, neo-Malthusians. And the economists, mostly the economics profession, says, look, this is ridiculous that we economists are aware that there are limits in the world, that even if the earth was completely hollowed out and filled with oil, it's still a finite amount of oil. It's not infinite. We get that. Maybe the universe is infinite, but other than that, systems have limits. We get that. But that technological innovation has always, spurred on by the market system, particularly capitalism, the profit motive, has spurred people to solve problems. And they make money and people get whatever fix. So as you're running out of whale oil, you don't just sit in the dark, you figure out something else to use to light your lamps, kerosene or what have you, right? So, and they said, so why would we think that's not going to happen? That technological innovation is going to push back the limits. They've written papers like, resources are not, they become. A rock is just a rock until somebody figures out a use for it. Now suddenly it's a resource. Now, of course, the counter argument is that, hey, we tried that in the model, right? We said, if there's a resource problem, let's fix it. If there's a pollution problem, let's fix it, and so forth. And you still could get the collapse. So Jorgen, remember the guy with the heavy Norwegian accent, one of the team members? So he did a presentation several years ago at the one of the System Dynamics conferences, and I was there, and he was showing off a version of his macro model that he was working on because he was trying to figure out how to show governments around the world, I guess, that it's possible to address these problems without destroying the economy. That's what his mission is. So he says to me afterwards, what did you think of my model? Because he's a physicist originally by training. I'm an economist. And I go, well, it's a good model. I said, except I don't think you got money right. He says, well, what do you mean by that? And I said, well, blah, 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 blah. And he goes, can you show me? And I go, yeah, sure. And it was supposed to take 15 minutes and we were at it like 3 hours. So here I'm going through I happen to have my laptop along and I had a bunch of stuff. So, so that's what he's working on now. Dennis is quite pessimistic, but Jorgen is running around the world trying to show governments how not to destroy their economies and address these problems. And he was talking about the national and international governance as being the leverage point. So we draw these things called causal loop diagrams when we do systems thinking. We're a little bit premature on these. So how did we draw these, or what do they exactly mean? Let's not worry about that just at this moment. But here is the debate of the neo-Malthusians versus the technological optimists, and whether or not you should cash out your retirement plan and plant a secret survival garden next to your bug out location and what have you, and getting your, what do they call those seeds? It's on the tip of my tongue, not antique seeds. They're the type of seeds that you can start again with all the crops. There's a legacy seeds. Now there's a name for it.
Heirloom.
Heirloom. That's it. Heirloom seeds. That's it. All right. So in the generic sort of debate it goes like that. There's human activity and it leads to more human activity. Basically what that positive loop says. But human activity also causes environmental stress. But pushing out the global carrying capacity reduces environmental stress. So think of human activity as demand and global carrying capacity as supply. I put on my economist hat, so supply and demand, right? So what is the global carrying capacity? Constants like space and sunlight. The sun, there's a lot of it, but the earth rotates, right? So it's not always shining. So it is finite. Same thing, obviously, with space. Renewables and non-renewables are involved. So renewables obviously are, things like trees. You can cut one down, but you can plant a tree and make another one. But also things like, ozone and air quality and stuff like that. Non-renewables, obviously the biggie is fossil fuels. Some people have actually tried to measure the global carrying capacity, like how many people could the global system support. Again, I'm a little bit, cool that somebody tried to do it, but I don't put a lot of stock in whatever numbers they come up with. Like, can the population double or whatever? But it's an interesting conversation starter. So environmental stress causes involuntary responses that reduce the growth of human activity. So this would be your famine, pestilence, and whatever that Malthus talked about, right? When we put, as you'll see as we go along later in the course, as we put two slashes, some people put a little box through an arrow. It means there's a significant delay between cause and effect. These are causal loop diagrams. So we're looking at causality. And that makes it very hard for people to see cause and effect. So something changes here and it causes something to change here, but only after a big delay. You don't, attach the one to the other. Okay. And when you have delays in negative feedback loop systems, the system can oscillate, as you'll see as we go along, go up and down. But this is what the economists would say, that human activity along with environmental stress. So human activity is like, there's more resources and what have you. And then stresses, here's a problem here, generates more technical knowledge. People solve problems, right? Motivated by the market system and all that. And that pushes out the global carrying capacity. But there can be harmful side effects from technology as well that can reduce the harmful side effects. Nuclear waste, where does it go? Stuff like that, and leaks and Fukushima and stuff like that. So really the ultimate solution in the limits to growth study, if you remember, was, I think we covered it, was the way to stabilize the system finally, even with all of the, natural resource technological changes and pollution technological changes and agricultural technological changes and perfect birth control, was value changes, where you got people to demand more services and leisure rather than more things. And when you did that, you were able to stabilize the system, at least if you started sooner rather than later. So the voluntary responses are to back off on some of the demands for stuff. And then that's, it's possible then to stabilize the system. Now, Herman Daly wasn't actually an economist who believed in all this stuff, formally trained. He recently just passed away, like within the last year. He was like 84 years old, but he had a very nice definition of sustainability that I think is useful in system dynamics. He was familiar with system dynamics and used it from time to time, although he wasn't like always showing up at the system dynamics conference or anything like that. But he always argued the following, that an ecologically sustainable system has three characteristics. One is that renewable resources are used at a rate no greater than that which they can be renewed. So if you chop down 10 trees, plant 10 trees. If you catch and eat 10 fish, hatch 10 fish, so on and so forth. Non-renewables have to be used at a rate no greater than that which they can be substituted for. So as that whale oil is going away, start finding a substitute, finding that kerosene and keeping your lamps lit at night. And then pollution is generated at a rate no greater than that which the environment can absorb. So nature can clean itself to a degree unless you overwhelm it, right? So did I mention the percolation through the soil, how it cleans water and all that? I'm not sure if I mentioned that. So, as long as you don't overwhelm the system, nature can clean itself. So you can build a system dynamics representation of these ideas quite easily, right? So here's your renewables, right? They're being used and renewed. Here's your non-renewables. There's only an outflow, not an inflow, but notice there's a substitution effect going on. As you're using up the non-renewable, you're finding substitutes, and then there's a pollution generation flow and a pollution absorption flow. So as long as you keep those balanced, the inflows are balanced by the outflows in the top and bottom, and then the outflow is balanced by the inflow of substitution, you have he argued, an ecologically sustainable economic system. So one thing I did some years ago, we can skip this, is I said, all right, let's see if we could take Herman Daly's definition of a sustainable economic system and make a game out of it. And let's see if we can start the game out of a sustainable state and tell the players of the game what a sustainable system is, and see if they can have complete control of this model economy. Let's see if they can get the model economy into a sustainable state. And so I built the model and made it into a game. And then I had, so you can see there's a bunch of stuff going on here. We don't need to go through all the details, but it's renewables, all the Herman Daly stuff. And there's some sliders and buttons and stuff that you could use. And then I got some students to do it for one of their projects, to run the game with students to see if anybody could get the thing into a sustainable state. And they ran it by like 60 students. Nobody could get it into a sustainable state. So at this point, it's like, wow, how are you going to pull it off in the real world if you can't even pull it off in a game where you have complete control of everything, perfect knowledge, and what have you? How a real policymaker is going to be able to do it? Well, I was going to the printer one day. At that time, you didn't have printers in your office. You had to go to the department office to print stuff out. So everybody's walking down the hall, grabbing their output and going back to their office. And I was pulling my output out of the printer, and we had a student helper who, worked like 10 hours a week or something. What do you call it? Student aid or whatever it is. You get a student job,
Work study.
Work study. That's it. Work study student. And her name was Jennifer Cover. And she says, "What are you doing, Professor?" I said, "Oh, we're doing this IQP. The students are, trying to get it into equilibrium or whatever, blah, blah, blah." She goes, "Can I try?" I go, "Yeah, sure." So I gave her the game, and she got it into a sustainable state. So she was able to do it. So we're like, she got so interested in system dynamics. She went after she graduated from WPI, she went to the University of Bergen and took a master's degree in system dynamics, and then worked in the system dynamics field for quite some time. Then she got married, had kids, and I'm not sure what she's doing now, but she was really, really good, and she was very clever, and she was able to do it. So anyway, and then of course, there are lots of people running around in the world with more free time than I will ever have. So some guy used Google Ngrams and found data. You can see his ordered pairs down here on the frequency of the use of the word sustainable in US English text as a percentage of all words by year. Okay, and then you have time on the horizontal axis. Here's his data. So this guy somehow fished this up. He had an outlier here, probably measurement error, but here's the present day. And then he projects it forward. So by 2036, sustainable occurs an average of once per page in US English text. By 2061, the word sustainable occurs an average of once per sentence. And by 2109, all sentences are just the word sustainable repeated over and over. So there you go. Okay, so well, isn't that interesting? That is what system dynamics is most known for. Most economists I would talk to about system dynamics years ago, when I was first starting out, would say, I don't know what that is. Or they would say, oh, that's the limits to growth. That was wrong. Those were the two responses I would get. And I was like, well, maybe it was wrong. In some sense, how do you know? Because it was going way out into the future. But it's like, system dynamics is calculus. So if you don't like a particular calculus model, you don't throw away calculus. You just say, I don't like this person's particular use of the tool. But somehow the economics profession, because of this stuff, primarily, I mean, Jay had his first memo where he's, and the urban dynamic, but it was really the world models that really got the economists to go after system dynamics as a farce. Oh, they were calling Jay a boy economist. They said one of the famous quotes I had in one of my papers was, system dynamics infests the social sciences like maggots on an organically grown peach. Particularly vivid criticism. So Suzanne, yeah, you got your hand up there. What's up?
So I was intrigued with Daly's whole little concept there, and you talked about values. I mean, is he implying morals? I mean, like, we have a moral responsibility to make policy choices that keep the system in equilibrium. I mean, what was the basis of the values?
Well, his teacher was a guy by the name of Georgescu Rogan. I think he was Hungarian or something. And he was a thermodynamics person. So he always used concepts from physics, entropy and whatever, to say there's limits to growth. And he taught Daly. So Daly ran with that concept, and he really spent a lot of time trying to devise a new system of national accounts to that GDP, which is always growing, it doesn't give you the full story, that you need a richer set of metrics to measure how we're doing. So that was really his thing, rather than being a modeler so much. But the value changes were but that was in the limits to growth, that the final sort of key was, value changes, not demanding so much stuff, but valuing services and leisure more. And that's actually quite an old idea in economics as well. Even John Maynard Keynes, the father of macroeconomics, was asked to talk about economics 100 years from now, and he did this in 1930. So it would have been 2030, and he felt that the economic problem, as he called it, would be solved: scarcity. Everybody would have enough stuff. So now what are you going to do with people? You don't need them to work. So he talked about leisure and services and whatever. So and even you hear about a minimum national income. Was it this guy Yang who ran for president last time around? He was really pushing that. And the idea was that then people could be free to pursue art or, whatever, and not just like in the old days, they have to stay alive. You had to, work every day to, have a sustainable subsistence wage. So kind of an old idea in economics, I guess. But yeah, so long story short, we could go on and on with the world model stuff. It got so controversial that system dynamics consultants would never mention the word system dynamics. at one point, like in the 80s, when I started in the 80s and 90s, they said it's too toxic because people think limits to growth. So they would say, you know, simulating differential equations or whatever. They just were barred from using the term, or they called it business dynamics. McKinsey, a very big consulting company, called it business dynamics. They didn't call it system dynamics to avoid the toxic terminology. So Jay is experiencing all this, and Dennis and whatever, and their students, and Jay always said he was flabbergasted that the economists didn't like what he did, and not only didn't like it, like really hated it. He said he never would have guessed. He's not an economist; he's an engineer. But you know, he never backed down either. So okay. So now we're in the 1970s, right? And what do we have? Stagflation. For the first time in the 20th century, there was the simultaneous occurrence of high levels of involuntary unemployment and high levels of inflation, which at the time, the economists had no explanation for, because inflation was an overheated economy and involuntary unemployment was an underheated economy. So how can you have an over and underheated economy at the same time? You know, during the Great Depression, during the 20th century, there was deflation. It wasn't inflation. So in the 70s, we had inflation and involuntary unemployment, stagflation for the first time. And for those of us who were around, you might remember there were 2 OPEC oil embargoes. You'd have to wait an hour in line to get gas, and you burn as much gas idling in line when you finally got up to the pump, and inflation was through the roof, and what have you. So Jay was like, well, you economists are criticizing me. I don't know what I'm doing. And he says, do you guys know what you're doing? You don't seem to know what's going on either. So what does Jay decide to do? He's going to build a macro model of the US economy using system dynamics. Okay. So he gets some funding, and off to the races he goes. He's going to build now he's really going to get on the macroeconomic turf of the economists. So what did Jay do?
Where's the funding for the national economic?
So I would say to Jay, you know, because, you know, he's up here inventing the computer and all those wonderful things. And there's me, a lowly, at the time, assistant professor, you know, and trying to get tenure. And, you know, he'd say, why are you writing for other economists? You know, they don't care about the economy. They care about writing papers in economics journals. He goes, you should do like I do, write for the general public and write for the business community. And I was like, I have to get tenure, and I only get tenure if I publish in economics journals. I'm like, not you. I didn't quite word it that way, but it's like, well, I have to do that, you know. So then when I would talk to him about funding, he goes, I never go to the National Science Foundation or any of those places for system dynamics funding. We went to the Navy and during World War II, but he goes, forget those people. He goes, you should go to cocktail parties and talk to people at cocktail parties. That's where I get all my funding, which was true. He would always talk about, he was at a cocktail party with the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation and talked to one of the Rockefellers, and they said, we'll fund you to do whatever. And I was like, well, I'm not even sure I could get in the door at one of those things, let alone be chit-chatting and be given, you know, millions of dollars in funding. So it was always private foundations like the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, and then private MIT grads who went on to earn a lot of money making engineering stuff and knew him from his engineering days and thought what he was doing was cool, and they would fund him. The Waters Foundation, Mr. Waters, I forget his first name. What was his name?
That's hilarious. I would have loved to have heard his little spiel at the cocktail party.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. Alan Borstein gave him a lot of money. He created Rob Roy. He was the first guy to, not the hair, but it was a men's clothing. And he opened up China and got the rights to all the Snoopy characters in the early 70s when Nixon did ping pong diplomacy and opened up China. He was one of the first guys over there, and he had all the Snoopy stuff made, or the Peanuts character stuff made for his clothing line, and he made millions, and he loved Jay's stuff. And so that's who gave him his funding. It's good. It's good to be Jay Forrester. So anyway, Jay is building his now national model. Okay. And what does he do? He does what he always did, was he rooted around and tried to talk to people, read, figure out what is going on, what's connected to what, and map it out. Okay. And when he did that, here's what he found. Now, he had students helping him, so it wasn't all just him. But nonetheless, when the students would give him, I got to find, sorry. I think it's this one here. Here we go. Yeah. When the students would do something that was useful, he would integrate it into his model. He would set them off and go figure this out, do it for your dissertation or your thesis. And then if there's something useful there, I'll incorporate it into my national model. So
is that kind of like I'll steal your novel ideas and take credit for it?
No, he didn't steal anything. He gave credit to everybody, and it was, you know, when you're on somebody, he would pay for their education. So that's how it's done in all the fields. Like if you're a physics professor and you're building an atom smasher and you get a giant grant and you write in 3 doctoral students, you interview them and bring them in, and then they're working in your lab on something. And then you say, figure this piece out, and that'll be your dissertation. And if you say, professor, I don't want to do that, I'm not interested, then they're like, too bad, you're on my money and I'm paying for you. So figure that out. And that goes into the big publication bin and everything. That's just how it works. So at any rate, what Jay found out was when he started running his model, that it had various behavior modes that were, you could turn them on and off and they were integrated and whatever. And you can, I won't specify, it could be GDP or whatever. Let's not worry about which variable it is. Just we'll get the general idea here. One of the modes was, I hope I'm hitting my phone here, sorry. Was that supposed to be exponential growth? It's kind of sloppy, but exponential growth. So it did that. And of course, that's every data set for every national economy. There is an exponential growth trend. No problem there. His model generated a business cycle. And by the way, it was doing all this stuff endogenously. So it wasn't being driven from the outside. It was the design of the system that was causing this. And peak to peak, trough to trough, the business cycle is on average in the data about 4 years. Now that's an average over many, many years, centuries, and I've drawn it kind of as a sine wave in his model. It's irregular, but you get the idea. There was some noise. So we put noise in our models to represent the things we aren't modeling. So for example, if you say, I want to model the demand for a product, for a widget or a service, what are the factors that will change or cause the demand for my product? Well, price or relative price, okay? Relative quality or relative perceived quality, relative delivery delay. You know, I'm hungry now and you just told me I want to eat at your restaurant, but it's a 45-minute wait, whereas across the street, I can be seated right now. I'm going across the street. And relative functionality, you know, my phone has more features than your phone kind of thing. And it could be other idiosyncratic features like, did a celebrity endorse it, the packaging, you know, what have you. So all the stuff that we're not modeling but could influence it is we represent with noise. Okay, so we choose what we're going to explicitly model, and the other stuff is noise. So there's noise in the model. But then what happened was, and I don't have enough space here, so I'll say we're going to go to another sheet here. The model also generated a long wave. And this had a cycle on the order of 40 to 60 years. Okay. So you could turn things on and off in his model. You can with any system dynamics model, but when you had everything turned on in his model, you had all these things interacting. So you had a business cycle riding on a long wave, riding on, it's hard to draw this with a mouse, but riding on exponential growth, right? All intertwined. What's Jay's reaction to this? His reaction was, I've clearly made a mistake. I've screwed up somewhere. Yes, there's exponential growth in GDP and economies grow and grow exponentially. No problem there. Yes, there's a business cycle. No problem there. Noise is fine. But this long wave thing is ridiculous. So obviously I.J. Forrester and or my students have made a mistake somewhere. So Jay said, you know, the economists are after me now. So I'm not going to publish this thing when it's got some weird thing in here that they're going to go after me for. So he said, I'll stop. We're not moving forward until we figure out what's going on here. Now, the model at this point was pretty big. So it took him quite a long time, on the order of several months, to go through everything equation by equation and running things in isolation, whatever, to ferret out where's the problem. And they did find a few clinkers here and there, a couple of dimensions that were wrong and whatever, but nothing that was like a plus sign that was supposed to be a minus sign. It was causing this giant wave or something. So after all of that time spent going over everything they had done with a fine-tooth comb, retesting everything over months, Jay concluded, I think the model's telling me something I don't know, which is really, if you think about it, that's the point of modeling, right? If you build a model and it doesn't tell you anything you could have known without the model, then you're just doing a sculpture, a mathematical sculpture for the intellectual joy of doing it. It's not helping you at all. Models should tell you things you don't know. And Jay's like, I think this thing is telling me something I don't know. So then and only then did he send the doctoral students scurrying to the Dewey Library with the task, find out if there's any information, any literature on an economic long wave in the economics profession. And guess what? There was. Nikolai, I always butcher these spellings. I think you can spell it with V instead of FF as well. Nikolai Kondratiev was a Russian economist, and he was in Stalin's government, pretty high up in the Minister of Agriculture or something. And he did a lot of research in the 1920s and early 30s showing these long waves in many of the economies, the data from many of the economies in Western Europe. Okay, so now Kondratiev didn't have an explanation for why they were happening. He just said, look at this. There are these long waves. These capitalist Western economies are going up and down over these very long spans of time. So this is known as the Kondratiev cycle or the economic long wave. So why was this not widely known? I mean, Jay knew about business cycles and exponential growth and whatever, but he never heard of the Kondratiev cycle. Well, certainly in the United States, econ professors, econ students are not taught about the Kondratiev cycle. I once had lunch with Paul Samuelson. I don't know if you ever heard of Paul Samuelson. He's the first American to win the Nobel Prize in economics. economics. He's known as the Einstein of economics. And I once asked him, what did you think about the Kondratiev wave? And he said, oh, during World War II, we used Fourier analysis and we're on data, and we concluded it doesn't exist. So he dismissed it. On the other hand, there were some economists like Joseph Schumpeter who wrote about it. So he's a very luminary. So, you know, a few American economists, well, Schumpeter was Austrian and he came over here. But so in Europe, particularly Eastern Europe, more economists would know about Kondratiev, but very few in the United States. Part of the problem, too, was that Kondratiev wrote in Russian, did not write in English. So all his books and papers on the topic were in Russian only, and somebody had to translate them and whatever. But then Kondratiev made a big mistake. He pointed out that it appeared to him that the Russian economy, the Soviet economy, had the same long wave in it. And Stalin got a hold of this. And of course, what was the interpretation? Yes, it's those damn capitalist economies have this horrible long wave in it. Because think about it. If there is a long wave, the Great Depression is not a one-time anomalous situation. It's a feature of a capitalist system. So Stalin was like, yeah, capitalism sucks. Look, you have these long waves. Kondratiev started seeing the same oscillation, he thought, in data from the Soviet economy. Stalin heard about that and had him arrested as a traitor, sent to the Gulag, put on trial, and immediately taken out back and executed by firing squad. And then they had all his papers and books and whatever removed from the annals of Russian/Soviet scientific history. Now, obviously, a few versions of it made it out of Russia because they were able to find some in the MIT library, but that's why it's not widely known. So Jay said, aha, not only does he have he didn't purposely make the model do that. He just modeled what he saw and generated this thing. But unlike Kondratiev, he had an explanation for why it was occurring. So why does it occur? And you're going to see this. There's a flight simulator that you can play with. I'll tell you part of the story there. So in a nutshell, what Jay's model was like this. This is a super simplified version of it. But you had a capital producing sector over here. Now, when we say capital in economics, we usually confuse everybody, including fellow economists, because the term can mean lots of different things. It can mean physical capital, machines, goods that are used to produce other goods, financial capital, human capital. So it's like a lot of times that even at the American Economic Association meetings, an economist will be making a presentation, capital, and somebody will say, stop. What do you mean by capital? You're not clear. What kind of capital are you talking about? So it's very common to well, what do we mean? But capital producing sector in Jay's model was the sector that produced machines, buildings, locomotives, hammers, the stuff that's used to make other stuff. Okay, what do I mean by other stuff? There was a goods producing sector. So the goods producing sector is the stuff that they make. It makes the stuff that you and I buy. So that would be, pencils and shirts and hats and cars and whatever. Now, the household sector is the entity that buys stuff from the goods sector, right? So it places its orders and it gets the stuff from the goods producing sector. Part of the household sector is in the labor force. Not everybody is, because if you're very young or very old, you're not, but some of the people in the labor force would work over here to make the stuff. And then you also need machines. So to make things, at a minimum, you need people and machines and raw materials and energy, whatever, but just simple people and machines. But to make the machines, you need people, right? And of course, the goods producing sector's ordering the machines it needs. But to make more machines, you need more machines. So where do you get them from? The capital producing sector has to order it from itself. And that's the capital self-ordering loop amplifies things, and you get this long wave. So the capital self-ordering loop is why in Jay's model, you got an economic long wave along with everything else. Okay. So, so Jay had an explanation for why the Kondratiev cycle was happening. The model could also mimic and very well lots of other macroeconomic data from the national income and product accounts in the United States. Of course, the economists started to say, well, Jay, you like to be controversial, so you purposely made a model do this, and now you're getting attention. And he said, no, I never heard of it. I thought I made a mistake. It was only after, we tore the model apart did I start looking to see if there was anything in the literature. So Kondratiev's great-grandchildren, by the way, wrote Jay a letter thanking him because of his work, Kondratiev's name was restored in the annals of Russian and Soviet, I don't know if it's Soviet anymore, but in the annals of Russian science, and they restored all of his papers and books and put them back in the library and what have you. Okay. So now we move into the 80s. And I start to come on the scene. But before I come on the scene, we have John Sterman. So John's a little bit older than me. So he was 3 years ahead of me. So John is a student at this time at MIT studying under Jay. And it's the summertime. And he's, in the summer we're off, right? The school is closed. So what to do in the summer? Well, as an undergraduate, John had been a student of Dennis and Donella Meadows at Dartmouth. And he went there because he read The Limits to Growth when he was in high school and tried to program it up in like BASIC on his own. And then he found out, oh no, there's software to do it, whatever, and they were doing it at Dartmouth. So he applied and he went to Dartmouth. And then Dennis and Donella said, hey, we got a smart kid here. Let's send him to MIT. So he went to study under Jay for his PhD. So it's the summertime, and he's not yet started on his dissertation. He's still doing his coursework and whatever. And Donella and Dana Meadows say to him, we are at IAZA, the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis. It's called IAZA. IAZA is located in Vienna, Austria. And it was created during the Nixon-Brezhnev years when there was détente. And it was seen as a way of bringing together Soviet and American scientists in one place, taking a systems approach and trying to work together to figure out ways where we wouldn't nuke each other. Okay. So Dennis and Donella were going to be there for the summer, and they said to John, well, you're our former student and you got the summer. Why don't you come over here and hang around with us at IAZA? So John said, okay, what do I got to do? And they said, well, you need a project. So you can't just knock on the door and say, hi, I want to, So it was an application, and he described his project, and he was, granted admission, and he went there for the summer. So what was his project? Well, John said, the economists are beating up Jay and his national model. And of course, they don't understand it, and they particularly think the Kondratiev cycle is wrong. I, John Sterman, am going to make a very simplified model and then game out of Jay's model. And let's see what happens. So that's what he did. And he called it Stratagem 2. Okay. So Stratagem 2 is on our list of quiz stuff. See if I can find it. I think it's this one. And Stratagem 2. Okay, so let's see what John did. So there's Kondratiev. I spelled it here with the V instead of the F's. There's John. So again, you can do this on your own. I'm not going to spoil it for you. But basically, the model is very simple. This is the whole economy compared to Jay's multi-thousand of equations model. And basically you run the economy, but you run it by running the capital sector. Okay. And your customer is the goods producing sector. So the goods producing sector is ordering from you. It's making orders, and you have to fill those orders from your customer, the goods producing sector. But you also have to make sure you have enough plant and equipment to do that. So you have to order from yourself. Okay. In a nutshell, that's what's going on. I don't want to spoil it for you, but you can read all the background information on the game, right? More background information on Kondratiev waves and whatever. So you have everything you have here to run the game. Basically, you just move this slider. But unlike some of the other simulators where it runs all the way to the end, it'll run for 2 years and stop. And you evaluate where you're at, make a decision, and run it again. It runs 2 years and stops, and so forth. And you see if you can run the economy. Now, your goal is to keep supply and demand balanced. Okay, so you have desired production and capital sector capacity. That's supply and demand. So you want the red and the blue line to be the same, and the ratio is 1 here at time 0. And you can move the economy forward by 2 years. Okay, now you'll see when you play the game. So this is kind of, in John's game, it's even simpler than this. Where's the stupid eraser? Let's see, is there an eraser here? Yeah, this is an eraser, right? Yeah, you don't even have this stuff here in the game. Or this stuff is exogenous. It's just the goods sector is getting its orders and making its orders to you. So you can see it's even simpler. So a lot of this stuff goes away in John's game. So super, super, super simple. So you have complete information, and you are the czar of the economy. You can do whatever you want. And the question is, what do you do when you play the game? Well, I can tell you, I played the game when it was first. I played it in like 1983, a long time ago. But here's what happens in the game. Nothing is preordained. There is no set pattern or whatever. Most people who play the game do this. They generate an economic long wave. John had students play the game, corporate managers play the game, and he invited economists who had written the Kondratiev wave doesn't exist. He didn't tell them about this. They played the game and they generated a Kondratiev wave. And he goes, I thought you wrote in whatever article that you said these don't exist. You had complete information on this little modest economy. You could do whatever you wanted. It's not preordained. It doesn't just do this. It can do lots of things. You generated a long way. He said some of them would just storm out. John also is fearless.
What's the causal mechanism? Why is it 40? Why is it 40 to 60 years? What's
It's the
behind
time
that?
constants and delays in the system. You know, you build a warehouse, it'll last a long time relative to a hamburger, which doesn't last very long when you eat it. So different
So
goods
most of
and
the
services
equipment
have.
that the building is built to last that long, basically.
Well, I mean, and it's in the aggregate, right? So you've got everything from locomotives to drill presses to hammers to, you know, whatever, right? So it's quite aggregated. But yeah, it's the time, and it's not a sine wave. It's not always 60 years or anything like that. It's irregular, but on average, it's in that frame, 40 to 60 years. And part of it got stretched out. Again, we can do a whole course just on the national model and the long wave. The Great Depression happened. That was the last official time anyway. We went down to the bottom of the long wave. And then they're like, well, how come you don't see it? And so, well, we invented macroeconomics. It got invented because of the Great Depression. Then World War II happened. So macroeconomics didn't get into action until after World War II. Right. And so we started having monetary policy and fiscal policy and damping some of that stuff and stretching it out and whatever. So left to its own devices, yeah, but you know, it's not as obvious as the business cycle is. But when you look at it in a variety, again, it's way beyond this course, but you start looking at the data and different metrics and stuff, you can see if there's a long wave, you would expect to find this, this, and this, and you will certainly see it in the data. Okay, so now economists are even more mad at the system dynamicists, and this is where I came along. I don't know if I told you the story the first time I went to MIT, and it was the Wizard of Oz thing. Did I tell you that story? I don't like to repeat my story. So
no, I don't think you told it.
Okay, so Jay's office complex was like this. And Jay's office was like here, but his old complex was here. This is where his conference table and stuff was. And then all out here he had all the filing cabinets for the D memos before they were PDF, when they were in paper form. And then you had desks out here for secretaries and whatever. He had some other offices, you know, like this. I don't know if he had the whole space, but there was a door here and there were elevators here. And there was somebody else doing who knows what over here. I don't ever knew what it was. And so I get off the elevator the first time and I was a student and I knock on the door here and Sturman answers. And he just sticks his head out. And he's like, yes, because the door was locked. And he said, Mike Rosicki, econ student. And he goes, egads, an economist. And he goes, we'll let you in anyway. And the door swings open and I'm admitted into the inner sanctum here. So, but the reason I was admitted was because I had written to Jay and said, I think you got it a little wrong. It's not economists hate system dynamics. Some economists hate system dynamics. You got to talk to the right economist. And I said, here, I've written a paper about it. I was like the guy sending him the manuscript, right? That like some guy he doesn't know. But unlike some of the other people that sent Jay stuff unsolicited, Jay contacted me and he said, I need to talk to you. Okay. So how did I get involved in all this? Are you guys bored with this? I can skip how I got involved unless you want to hear because I'm kind of nearing the end of the story. You want to hear about this? Yes, no, yeah, okay. All right. I warned you. So I'm an econ student, right? So let's see what do I have here. All right, yeah. So I came of age in the I guess you'd say late 1970s. So, and I was the oldest in my family. So when I turned 18, the Vietnam War was over. So I didn't have to worry about that. Some of my buddies were like the youngest in the family. They had older brothers that went over to Vietnam and all that. So it was a much bigger issue in their household. My household, it wasn't, by the time I was nearing, the draft age, the draft was over, right? So that wasn't on the table very much as in like an issue for my generation or whatever you call it, but my age group. But the economy was, right? Because I mentioned in the stagflation, OPEC oil embargoes, and all that stuff. So my dad says to me one day, he would read the Wall Street Journal every day. And he slaps it down one day. He says, you're getting older. Read the front page and the editorial page and tell me one thing you found out. My dad was an accountant. And I was like, huh? What? Oh. All right. So I did. And I found that I thought it was kind of interesting. Oh, so next day, same thing. Read the front page, editorial page, 10 minutes. By like the fifth day, I didn't have to be told. I said, give me the paper. I want to read it on my own. I got real interested in economics. And at the time it was inflation. Inflation was really the big thing. And first Gerald Ford and then Jimmy Carter, they're running around with whip inflation now buttons and all sorts of things. Mortgage rates were going through the ceiling. You had 18% mortgage rates and all sorts of crazy things. So I said to my parents I was going to be a macro. I wanted to work at the Fed. I wanted to be a monetary economist. My mother wanted me to be a naval officer, however. So I applied to the Naval Academy and I got in. And so I was going to go to Annapolis. My dad was happy because there's no tuition then. And they had me going to all these meetings with retired naval officers, and they were teaching me how to make my bed and stuff like that. So when I got there, I wouldn't be picked on or whatever. And one day the head poobah says to me, Mike, what do you want to do in the Navy? And I said, fly Tomcats off a carrier, sir. This is before Top Gun. I think it was Tomcat. I might have said Phantoms. I don't remember what it was, whatever the aircraft was. And they always had a clipboard. And out comes the clipboard, and he had the glasses down to here, and he's flipping through. And he goes, with your eyesight, you ain't flying nothing off of nothing. I'm wearing contact lenses. I'm like, what do you mean? He goes, they don't let people with 2200 vision fly. Are you out of your mind? I'm like, why not? He goes, they just don't. So then I'm like, I'm 17 and an idiot, you know. It's like, so then what am I gonna, like, what could I do? I had no idea. Again, the chart comes out, the clipboard, and flipping through, and he goes, oh, with your math score, you're gonna be an engineer. You'll probably like run a nuclear reactor in a submarine. I go home, I go, Ma, I don't want to run. I don't want to be in the engine room of a submarine. It's like, I want to do that. Of course, I'm 17 and fair because I thought, you know, they would have told me that's kind of like what I was going to do. Of course, that wasn't what I was going to do. They just gave me a for instance, right? And then I said, well, I'm interested in economics. And then the academy at the time didn't have an econ major. They had an econ minor. I said, I can't even major in economics. So I said, I don't want to go. My mom says, well, you better tell Congressman Steiger you're not going. So I wrote him a letter, thank you, but no thanks. Now I'm supposed to be going to college somewhere. I didn't fly anywhere.
So you're 17, you're just getting started on that.
Yeah, but I was way down the road. So I just applied to a local college, and by the stroke of God's luck, they had a great economics program. I had no idea, but I just, you know, I was like, you got a weight room? Okay. 17 and stupid, you know. I had some great economics teachers. And one of them was he was a guy from India, and he did his PhD under Larry Klein, who won the Nobel Prize in economics for pioneering econometrics. And Thampy, my teacher, built the first econometric model for the country of India. So, I mean, he was pretty, and we had some other people who were pretty well connected in the profession. So one day, when I was a senior, Thampy, my Indian teacher, said, Klein is coming to speak at the University of Wisconsin. He's going to go see him, being his former doctoral student. Do I want to come along? I'm like, of course. So down we go, and we meet Lawrence Klein, and there was also Bob Eisner there from Northwestern. And so I'm chit-chatting with these guys, you know, and everything. And I said to Thampy then, why don't we invite these guys to St. Norbert? You know, we can do that, can't we? And he goes, well, yeah, if people will come. I don't want to invite these guys and then, you know, nobody comes to see them talk. So he says to me, if you can convince me people will come to talk, I'll invite them. So what I did was I went to the Green Bay Chamber of Commerce, and I got their mailing list, and I sent out a survey to the Brown County business community, and we found out overwhelmingly they would come and hear a Nobel Prize winner and all that. So we put on this economic summit, and they came and all this. So Eisner says to me, I want to see your PhD application at Northwestern. You can work with me. He had been president of the American Economic Association. So I'm like, oh, pretty good. So anyway, long story short is I thought I was going to go to Northwestern. I was admitted and all that. But I also got interested in a program at Notre Dame. And I got interested. It was a more interesting program than I was in at Minnesota, Wisconsin, Northwestern, and then Notre Dame. I just thought Notre Dame was a more interesting program. There's a whole story as to how I picked Notre Dame, but I went to Notre Dame. The reason it was more interesting was in the first year, they taught you the orthodox stuff. In the second year, they taught you the heterodox stuff, the oppositional stuff to the orthodox stuff. And then you could do your dissertation in any area you wanted. Okay. so that's the background. So let me give you, show you my slideshow here. So there's this guy here, Chuck Wilbur. So it's our first class in our second year. So it's like August 28th or something in my second year of graduate school, right? And we're sitting, it was a required class in like economic methodology. I didn't know what that meant, but I was a good student. So I'm there first, bright and early, eager, notebook out, pencil sharpened, ready to go. And there's like 12 of us in the library, and it was like a conference room in the library, and we're at talking. And do you know what this is about? No. You know who the prof is? He's around, but I don't really know him. Yeah, okay, whatever. So in walks Chuck Wilbur. So he walks to the front of the room, and he has this giant pile of books and papers and stuff, right? And there's a table and then a little lectern thing at the front. And we're all because class hadn't started yet. And he takes this giant pile of stuff and just drops it. And it goes bang, and it hits the table really loud. And everybody stops and looks up, and he grabs the lectern and he leans out over it. And he goes, "How do you know if an explanation for something is true?" First words out of his mouth. And I'm thinking, geez, like, you didn't even give us the syllabus yet. Like, come on, man. Like, then I was like, wait a minute, that's a pretty good question. Think about it. How do you know if an explanation for something is true? What causes lightning? Right? Well, it's obviously Zeus was able to harness the element's power to use as a weapon, and he was hurling lightning bolts. That's where it comes from. No, that's not a right explanation. That's silly. Socrates has supposedly said, that's not Zeus up there. It's a vortex of air during a thunderstorm. Okay. Well, is that true? Well, if you look at that link there, you'll find out to this day, scientists are not 100% sure what causes lightning. There are various explanations for it. How about the heavenly bodies? This is kind of a famous one. Aristotle said, so the sun orbits the earth, right? Because God made the earth and we're the center of everything and all that. Tycho Brahe said, yeah, the sun orbits the earth, and he made precise measurements, right, of the movements of the heavenly bodies. Copernicus said, no, the earth orbits the sun. You got it backwards, but in a circle. Kepler said, nah, the earth orbits the sun, but in an ellipse, and Kepler was right. And then Galileo, of course, created his telescope and made observations that confirmed this, and then he got in trouble with the Vatican and had to recant and all that stuff. But again, how you're observing the movement of the heavenly bodies. What's causing them? What's the explanation? Well, what we found out is that there's schools of thought in economics. I never knew this. As an undergrad, I was just like, well, here, read these books and these lecture notes, and that's economics. Spit it back to me on a test. Well, here I'm finding out in the second year, because that was the heterodox year. Whoa, there's schools of thought, and not all economists do economics the same way. And I'm taking notes left, right, up, and down. I never heard this before. Like, what the heck? Okay. So I made, for one of my papers, I made this diagram here, and it starts with old Adam Smith, and it works its way down to all different schools of economic thought. I was just drawing it out on scratch paper one day because I wondered where all these schools of thought came from. So it looks like a bird's nest. But at any rate, there's schools of thought. And what do we mean by schools of thought? They're not literal buildings, but they are groups of economists who do economics the same way. So they publish in the same journals, they read the same journals, they go to the same conferences, they know one another, they train doctoral students and swap them among their universities or departments in the same school of thought. Okay. So I was like, as a student, I'm like, I didn't know all this. This is like, okay, wow, like, holy cats. By the way, the reason I selected Notre Dame's program, I thought it was more interesting than Wisconsin, Northwestern, Minnesota, which were all kind of the same, was the heterodox stuff interested me because I always thought it was weird that economists never got out from behind their desks to find out what went on. So you did economic theory, which was you built a mathematical thing, And then empirical work meant you'd go and download, well, then you didn't download it. You'd get a big reel-to-reel tape of numbers and you torture them with statistics and econometrics. But I always would ask the teachers, well, why don't we ever like go out to a bank and find out what bankers do? Or why don't we go, if somebody's pricing something, ask people, well, how do you do it? And they're like, well, that's not how you do economics. Well, come to find out, there are other schools of thought that do that. And so I was like, oh man, I didn't know this. So I'm just taking notes, whatever, it's all good. So it boils down to, and it's people who do philosophy of science and all this stuff, I'm going to torture and oversimplify this. But in a nutshell, to me, it boiled down to these two guys here, Descartes versus Hume. So when you draw a graph, that's a Cartesian plane named after Rene Descartes. He argued that you explain things scientifically by starting with the mind and starting at the most general level. So you start with theory, a general theory about how things work, and then from that you derive a testable hypothesis. Then you go to the real world, make observations, and see if the observations confirm the theory or not. So you start with the theory, you start with the general, and you work your way down to the specific instance. And you start with logic and the mind, because observation can be misleading. It can be optical illusions and stuff like that. So David Hume says, no, you're wrong. It's just the opposite. You start with the real world, with the specific, and look for patterns. And if you find regularities, you keep accumulating them until you build your way up to theories and principles. So Hume said you use inductive reasoning, and Descartes said you use deductive logic or deductive reasoning. And obviously these are, top down, bottom up, they're obviously at odds. Huge oversimplification of this whole thing. We had a whole course on this stuff, so you can imagine how deep into the weeds you can get. I'm going to skip some of the details, but let me give you an example of what I mean. This is what Descartes would say if he were alive and was doing economics, and this is the traditional way of doing economics. So here's a paragraph from the General Theory. This is the book that created macroeconomics. John Maynard Keynes wrote it during the Great Depression to explain why is the Depression happening and how do we get out of it. He wasn't trying to create macroeconomics, but he did as that's what happened. And he says, my whole edifice starts with a fundamental psychological law. And I'm not going to even bother to read it, but he blah, 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 blah. Okay, in words. Okay, if you decipher his words, it's very simple. He said, basically, my whole theory, macroeconomics, rests on these two things. As household income goes up, household spending goes up. So if you have more income to spend, you spend more. And as household income goes up, the fraction of household income spent goes down. In other words, the fraction of household income saved goes up, which makes sense. If you have more income, you save more. Okay, that's what all this gobbledygook means. Okay, well, guess what? You can translate these two things. There's a weather warning again. You can translate these two things into a theory. I mean, it was a theory, but into math. And you can translate it into a line. Okay, the first thing here says, as y goes up, c goes up. As y goes up, c goes up, you have a positive slope of a line. When one goes up, the other goes up. It goes from southwest to northeast, right? And the second one is a little trickier. When y goes up, the fraction of income spent, so as you go this way, c over y goes down. So you find c over y, this is c, this is y, it's the slope of this ray. So as you go farther out, the ray, the dotted line gets flatter. So the fraction of income spent gets less. In other words, they're saving more. Okay, so that was basically he's saying, I'm looking at the world and this is what I see. So I'm going to start my whole theory based on this. And you make it into math, that's what it is. Descartes would say, now you go and get data. You observe the world, and if you do that, there's Y and C, both for time series data and cross-sectional data. This is a famous controversy because in the theory, notice it has to strike above zero here, the intercept term. And with cross-sectional data, it doesn't. It's minus 55. With time series data, but with cross-sectional data, it does. It's known as the Keynesian consumption function controversy. So you get into this Keynes' theory right, or is the data wrong, or whatever. But that's how you do traditional economics. That's what I was taught as an undergrad and in my first year of grad school. But here's the point of the story. Chuck Wilber tells us, but that some schools of thought don't do that. They reject that. They say, you know, this sort of mathematical modeling doesn't capture the richness of an economy. It leaves out all sorts of important stuff. No good. They said instead, in heterodox economics, you use something called pattern modeling. Okay, this is the Hume thing. You look for patterns. Okay, so you're like a physician trying to diagnose a disease, or a detective at a crime scene. You're presented with a problem and you're trying to figure out why is it happening. Okay, these people tried to make economics into a science like physics, because this is how physicists do their thing. You know, Einstein comes up with a mathematical general theory of relativity, and it's supposed to, you know, you can find out from an eclipse if the light is bending around the sun on an eclipse. You take your measurements. You know, that's trying to make economics into like physics, the physics of the social sciences. These guys say that's wrong. Economics is more of a profession rather than a science. It uses some scientific stuff, but you're more like a doctor or a detective rather than a physicist. Okay, so pattern modeling is the case study approach, like at the Harvard Business School, or many business schools actually. Okay, you can describe a very rich pattern of what happened in a company or an industry. The detective or the physician, when trying to figure out what's going on, looks for clues, symptoms of the person who's sick, clues at the crime scene, and tries to piece them together into an explanation. You have this disease. Here's what happened at the crime scene. Okay, so you're basically making a mosaic. You're taking pieces of a system, clues, and linking them together into a coherent whole. So you're using a systems approach, the elephant's tail and ear and leg and tusk and whatever, and putting it together. If you find regularities in many of the pattern models, like a detective will find that in the last 3 crime scenes, there was a burglary and a cigarette butt was left at the scene, the same brand of cigarette. That's a regularity. Okay, perhaps a different set of crimes, a gum wrapper was always left at the scene of the crime, same person. So the commonality, which would be called real topologies, so you're building up in patterns, are called real typologies. That criminals typically leave something at a crime scene. And then if you find regularities among the real typologies, these are the types would be one burglar leaves a cigarette butt, another burglar leaves a gum wrapper, and then the general principle is criminals often leave something behind at a crime scene. And they said, Chuck Wilber taught us the most important principle of economics following this methodology is circular and cumulative causation. And Gunnar Myrdal won the Nobel Prize for applying that concept to developing nations. Okay, and they also said, you know, these circular and cumulative forces cause the system to evolve over time. So it's a dynamic point of view, but it's non-mathematical. Okay, so what do? I'm at the library. I know I'm running a little low on time here, but I'm at the library. I'm going to skip some of these things here. I'm at the library and I take a study break. And not a long study break. I wasn't going to leave the library and go have dinner. So I just was stretching my legs for 10 minutes in the stacks. And I'm just walking around the stacks, and I spy a book by some dude named Jay Forrester. Never heard of the guy before. I'm like, what's this? And I pull the volume off and I'm open it up. It was actually a book of readings. And the first reading was by Forrester, and he was the editor of the book. And it was an introduction to system dynamics. What is it? And I'm reading it. And he says, well, you use a systems approach, you find the pieces of the system, you hook them together. generalities are called generic structures. Then there are underlying principles of systems. And I'm like, this sounds a lot like what Chuck was telling us just the other day in class, right? So what do? I go running into class the next day, and say, oh, professor, I found this, whatever. And I'm thinking I'm going to get at a boy, Mike, good job. He was horrified. He said, you're trying to mathematize my stuff, because he was a heterodox economist. And remember, this stuff is non-mathematical. It's like the Harvard case study approach. You can't possibly make a rich tapestry of a case study with math. Now, he wasn't thinking about simulation. Back in the early 80s, economists didn't do simulation. No idea what simulation was. So I was like, I'm just telling you what I found. I'm not trying to undermine you. So he gathers himself to his credit and he goes, hell, you got to write me a paper, write it up. So I did. At the end of the term, he gave me an A on the paper and he said, grudgingly, I guess I'll have to learn that system dynamics stuff. I think you're right. To his credit, he helped me get it into publication. It was my first solo journal article, first publication that I had. Okay. So, and I called it institutional dynamics, because the two groups of economists at that time who kind of did what a system dynamicist would do were institutional economists and post-Keynesian economists. So, we have the principle of accumulation and feedback loops. They have circular and cumulative causation in institutional economics. And the post-Keynesians had stock, flow, consistent modeling, and we have stocks and flows and feedback loops. And those economists, the post-Keynesians and the institutionals, would attend each other's conferences. There were different schools of thought, but neighborly, right? So I said, I think I'm onto something here. So long story short, what time is it here? Long story short, let me get out of here. So long story short is I tried to establish, so once I got my papers published, I started getting opportunities to speak at universities around the world on this, heterodox university. And at the same time, Apple Computer came out with the Macintosh for the first time. And Barry Richmond came out with Stella, a software package for the Macintosh. So I said, I'm going to take the Macintosh and Stella and institutional dynamics, and I'm going to make a program out of it. So Apple Computer gave me 33 Macintosh computers right when they came out. And I established a computer lab at Notre Dame to do this. The only time I ever flew first class was Apple was flying me around the country, giving talks at other universities about what I was doing. They wanted me to, as a professor, to spread the word. Right. By this time, I was an assistant professor, by the way. Forrester had summoned me, and I had convinced him that you got to talk to the right account. The first time I was with Jay, he said to me, let's go have lunch. I was a student, so I'm like, yeah, cool, free lunch. And we go to a nice restaurant, and he says, order anything you want. So I do, and he ordered, I don't remember, I ordered like a steak sandwich. I don't know what he ordered. I don't remember. Food comes. I start eating. I'm starved. He takes out a notepad and a pencil, doesn't eat, touches food, just interviews me the whole lunch, asking me about heterodox economics and what do these guys do, and whatever. And so he changed his, if you watch some of his later tapes and writings and stuff, he talks about this stuff. I convinced him to, that, it's not all economists, but you got to talk to economists in the right schools of thought. So that's how I got involved. So I know I'm running out of time here. How did I get to WPI and what's going on at WPI? To wrap this up, or, maybe we'll slurp a little bit into what the doctoral students are doing now next time. But the people at Notre Dame where I was teaching, they kept me on in the faculty because they said, this kid is, they didn't understand what I was trying to do. Because today people have video games and, but there was no internet back then. Using simulation in economics was unheard of. This sounded like some engineering thing. Like, why are you doing engineering stuff you're an economist? The journal editors, I needed help from other senior people to get the papers published because the journal editors say, we don't understand what you're doing. It looks pretty cool and sophisticated, but we can't interpret what you're doing. The referees all shrug and go, I don't know what to say about this, right? So, but I was bringing in grants. I was doing all this stuff. So Notre Dame finally told me, you're an untenured assistant professor. Untenured assistant professors don't start programs around here. We're not gonna let you do this. Whatever the hell you're doing, it sounds weird or whatever. It's not like, why can't you just do like the traditional stuff? And I was kind of like, well, aren't we supposed to be innovating and whatever? But okay, whatever. So I left. I resigned and I looked for a place where I could do my thing. WPI happened to be looking for exactly me, except I said, not only can I teach what you want me to teach, but I use an engineering technique, a technique that has its origin in engineering, and I'll be teaching engineering students. And by chance, it was located 40 miles from Jay. It wasn't located, WPI wasn't located in Oregon or something where so I was like, this is a hand to glove fit. So I resigned at ND and I just packed up the family and we drove 1,000 miles out to WPI and we started the program in system dynamics. And then, and at that time, Jay would come over all the time to WPI and everybody, there was quite a flow back and forth between us and MIT and what have you, as I kind of alluded to before. So I spent a lot of my time trying to figure out how to get the economists and the system dynamicists to work together. I've had some success. You can't just drop in on even the heterodox economists and basically say, you don't know what you're doing. You should, do what I tell you to. That doesn't work. They bristle at that, obviously. So you gotta approach it the right way. But we've had some successes in convincing real economists and their students to use system dynamics. In fact, the System Dynamics Society will tell you the two most frequently asked questions they get at the central office are A, where do I go to learn how to do system dynamics at a high level? And B, I'm interested in economics and system dynamics. So lots of people want to know how to do it and then how to apply it in economics in a manner that will be accepted by both system dynamicists and economists. Because some of the economists who tried to do it early on, they'd get a hold of Stella or something and they'd build horrible models. They were just trying on their own. There was no thing like we're doing now back in the 80s to teach somebody, right? So not good. The system dynamicists will say, these guys are producing horrible models. We can't publish these things. They're terrible. And the economists were like, well, we see what you're doing. And yes, it fits us. Okay, cool. However, and they would have, what about this? What about that? And, until those questions were answered, they weren't going to fully buy in. Basically, the message I got, and I was much younger, the basic message I received from the older heterodox economists was, you go, girl, this is good. Like, I'm not about to do this. I'm nearing the end zone of my career, but you go ahead and do this. This is good stuff. So, and then the younger people were the ones who were interested, doctoral students and stuff like that, to actually learn how to do it. But as you're maybe beginning to see, doing it at a very high level is not trivially simple. It looks kind of easy. Oh, bathtubs and faucets. But we were just beginning to scratch the surface, right? And it's tricky. It's easy to produce a crummy model. It's hard to produce a very good, insightful model. There's a way to do it. And if you do it systematically, we can teach you how to do it. But you can't just sort of pick up industrial dynamics and read it and go, oh, I know how to, I'm Jay Forrester now. It's not that easy. I don't think some people are, you got a bell curve. There's always Johnny Genius and Sally Genius way out on the tail, who they hear one talk on it and they can do it at a very high level. But most of us require some practice and mentorship and whatever to learn how to do it at a very high level. But so, all right. So again, we have a lot of time till December. So that's why I don't do all this stuff I'm doing with the undergrads. We don't have the time, but I give you guys, particularly if you're going to be in the field, in the field of system dynamics coming out of our program, you want to know the history of our program and how we fit into the big narrative of system dynamics. So you kind of have the oral history of the field to some degree. You can talk with the old timers.
I think you're using the analogy of the discovery of the structure of the solar system and to talk about the different ways of the development of system dynamics and economists and all that is interesting. And I just, to me, there's so many different things. Like, I don't know that every single school of thought is, you know, completely a loser. They have little pieces of it, and eventually it evolves to something that gives more clarity. And sometimes I'm actually reading American Prometheus right now about Oppenheimer, and there's, you know, the development of new discoveries and ideas and ways of thinking. There's so much professional competition and naysaying just to be right because you've been the king of the mountain for a long time, it seems like. And yet I think as something new evolves, there's validity in each perspective. It's not all or none thinking. That's what it sounds like.
Yeah, some of the heterodox economists too are very stubborn. You know, everything the other side does sucks. And it's like, not everything, you know, not everybody's an idiot. You know, they might have a few things to say that are legitimate as well. You gotta have in my opinion, you're right. You have to be wired to say, I'm interested in science and pursuing advancement of the human condition. I'm not concerned about my school of thought, my publication record, if you get new information, a new technique, and it leads you into a different direction, so be it. But not everybody can do that. They've been successful doing what they do.
Yeah. Well, and it seems like the way we reward academic pursuits doesn't really foster that way of thinking.
You bet. Jay always said the economists don't care about the economy. He goes, why are you writing for them? He goes, write for the business community and the general public. Right. They'll care. Right. He's right, you know. So I mean, that's one of the reasons sort of behind trending cycles. It's like, you know, to always just do everything inside the academy as opposed to just people who want to learn the stuff, you know, might be a better, you know, at least one way about going about our business, you know. So, all right. So, again, a lot of background information, but hopefully you found the narrative kind of interesting. And, you know, like I say, depending on the audience, I wouldn't go into all this detail, but it, you know, coming out of our program, and if you're going to be in the field beyond a single course, I find it's kind of good to know who the players are and some of the gee whiz stories and how things came about. And there's a million stories, you know, over the course of the term. You'll probably hear most of them. But, you know, you just, when you meet people then at the conference or whatever, you'll, you know, oh, Radzicki talked about him. I kind of know the background as to who this person is and what their thing is and, you know, this sort of thing. So, so we'll be pushing on. We will be getting to how you build models. So don't worry if you're eager to get going. And you can always, push ahead. And there's all the quizzes and exercises are there now. So, I mean, be my guest if you want to go faster than I'm going. That's fine. It doesn't bother me in the least. But we try and take things, you know, step by step, systematically, and get people introduced properly into, you know, there's National, I mentioned to her in an email that there's this bell curve, I think, where, you know, on the one tail is people, they hear 3 lectures in system dynamics and they're suddenly Jay Forrester. They just pick up on it like they're naturals. Then you got the people in the other end of the tail of the distribution who, no matter what you do, how much you teach them, they can't do it. They just never get it. It doesn't resonate. But most of us are in the center of the bell curve, right? And so for the majority of people, they go through the same sort of process, which is the beginner level where you learn the field, the software, the basics of how you do it, some famous models. You're able to open up somebody else's model and understand it and use it properly. That's kind of the beginner level. The intermediate level requires more study, and you can build an original model typically on your own. It's just not terribly insightful. You know, it grows exponentially, and you say, if I make this parameter bigger, it grows faster exponentially. Well, yeah, but it's technically correct. And, you know, nobody's done exactly that before. That's cool. But that's kind of the intermediate level. where you kind of don't need the model to know what's going to happen, right? But it's technically correct. But this is the journey that most people take. And then the advanced level is where you can build an original model from scratch, and it tells you things that you didn't already know, right? There's some counterintuitive things and what have you. And I think the highest level is the ability to go into a group of experts and stakeholders who know a lot about something. They're and you work with them 50 times, you meet with them 50 times, and they're telling you everything under the sun because they do it every day, all day for the last 30 years. And from that, decipher the information necessary to build an insightful system dynamics model that they will accept. I think that's the highest level of skill in system dynamics. And I think that's not very few people can do that well. It takes a special personality. And a lot of times consulting companies, whatever, have a team of people. The person working the room isn't necessarily the person building the model, kind of thing, because one person being able to do all of that, it's very difficult. But that would be kind of like the super advanced level if I were to sort of make buckets, right? But there's this, my point is there's a natural progression for most people on how you learn this stuff. And it just requires some level of patience to, systematically learn how to do it. Having said that, we will be introducing the software here in the near term and starting to build stuff. So, so if you're eager to get going, that'll be happening. Yes, Nejla, please. What's up?
Oh, is one of the common approaches that people take in system dynamics to test the economic models or theories of other heterodox economists, like institutional economists or whatnot, because I live in Bloomington, and so I've heard a little bit about Elinor Ostrom and read
Nobel laureate. Yeah.
Yeah, I like to just throw some of her stuff in every now and then to some of the local stuff I'm doing. Really impresses people.
Yeah.
And I think she called herself a new institutional economist.
Yeah, right. So she would be cut from the heterodox.
You guys, I gotta go. I'll see you next week.
Okay.
Bye.
So she would be someone that's cut from the heterodox cloth, and you would be reading her books, and she would provide a rich description of something, and you'd be saying, how do I turn what she's writing about into a formal model? Therein lies
she devised 8 rules for creating cooperative institutions, right? And I think her actual research methodology is more what you would consider a traditional. Well, I mean, it's not just econometric data. She did a lot of qualitative research in the field, but I don't think she used system dynamics.
No, I don't think so. But that's the kind of stuff you could realistically translate into a formal system dynamics. One of my doctoral students, Saeed Langarudi,
maximizing cooperation in an institution or something.
Yeah, one of my doctoral students, Saeed Langarudi, he's teaching at the University of Bergen now, for one of his dissertation papers, took a theory. It was actually a lot of different papers and books by an Oxford, I guess, historian. I'm not sure what his official role was, named Khatouzian. And he wrote a lot about the Iranian socioeconomic system, but did it all descriptively. And so Saeed took all of his papers and books and stuff and read them and translated it into a system dynamics model and simulated the implications of it. And I said, send it to Khatouzian, see if he responds. And he did. And he liked it. He said, yeah, you captured what I'm saying. So yes, that would be an excellent thing to do. One thing that I like to do is I'll take a fairly well-known model that somebody's produced, a heterodox economist, and translate it into system dynamics and show it to the economist. And today they'll use but they don't think about feedback loops. So I'll say, let's look at the feedback loops. And it blows their mind because they don't realize their own models have feedback loops in them.
Is that what Steve Keen did with Minsky? Is
that
Minsky's economic theory put into a model?
So Steve has the Minsky software program that he uses to build all sorts of models, including a model of one of Hyman Minsky's theories. Yes.
Okay.
And Steve's models have feedback loops and all that in them. What I'm getting at is you can translate Eleanor's model into System Dynamics or somebody else's model and simulate it and Cartesian, whatever. And that usually is insightful to a lot of these people. But sometimes in modern times, these economists will also do simulations. So the fact that you can simulate it, to some economists, they're like, well, we do simulation too, a little bit differently, but whatever. But where you blow their socks off is you say, you think about the feedback loops in your model, what they mean. And when we talk about redesigning the airplane, we redesign the feedback structure. They have no idea. What does that mean? And you show them the loops in their own models, in their own theories, and which ones are dominant and when and why that matters. And they're like, because they're just not taught to.
And that's because of the things that are pointed out in Sturman's book, that where people intuitively don't think logarithmically.
Oh, well, there's a lot of cognitive limitations as well. Absolutely. But what I'm talking about is how I'll get economists who actually are kind of doing what we're doing. They do simulations, they do dynamics, right? And so the fact that you show them dynamics, they're like, well, we do dynamics. That doesn't, they're like, so, and then you say feedback loops. Do you realize in your own models, you have, your famous whatever model, you have 11 feedback loops. Did you realize that? And they're like, no, what do you mean? And you show them, they're like, and then why does it matter? So I think that's because with feedback, you can get locked into crappy situations, either due to policy resistance, which is negative feedback loops. We'll talk about that next time, or path dependency, which is positive feedback loops. So you can get locked into a crummy situation, a poverty, or income inequality, or
non-cooperating
global, whatever the problem is. It doesn't, pick one. And there is a feedback loop explanation for why it's happening, and a feedback loop solution. Yes, it's dynamic too, but it's the loops that are causing the problem. And people do not think that way. They're not trained to think that way. They're certainly not trained to think that way in economics. Absolutely. A control engineer, an electrical engineer that does control systems, is taught feedback systems, but they think about them in terms of circuits and stuff. They don't think about it in terms of socioeconomic systems. So we really have quite a unique niche. If you go agent-based modeling, those models are loaded with feedback loops, but you can't find them because there's no way. It's such a, all these 100,000 agents interacting in some random way to figure out the feedback loop. They're there somewhere, but you just can't, with current technology, figure out where they are, which ones are important and when, and how would you redesign things from a feedback perspective. So it's not that agent-based modeling is a poor technique. It just, we have a particular way of doing things that allows us to offer particular explanations for why things are happening and particular solutions. And they are quite different from what everybody else has to offer. Are they better? Yeah, let somebody else decide. But we have a unique way of going about our business. But my contribution was, there are schools of thought in economics, actually real life economists with PhDs in economics, that do economics in a way that is perfectly harmonious with this, what I've just described. They talk about circular and cumulative causation, but they don't model it.
Well, yeah, there's, all kinds of books about donut economics and circular economies and.
Right, exactly, right. And that's more recent, but yes, absolutely, right. So that's where I think in the economic world, we have a leverage point, or we can make some headway as system dynamics.
Paradigm shift, right? The number one leverage point.
And I think talking to the public, the media, the business community, putting stuff on server games like these flight simulators, like I've given you the links to, where they're user friendly and people can play around with them. And I think that people are used to playing video games these days. It doesn't freak people out like when I was a young assistant professor. They're like, well, I have no idea what the hell you're doing. now it's people yawn at simulation. I mean, it's everybody thinks they live in the metaverse anyway.
Yeah, it's no Grand
Matrix.
Theft Auto.
So, or Grand Theft, yeah, or any of the famous, right? Exactly. So I think we can reach, but Jay was always right. The man was always right. It's like just trying to get the American Economic Association to become system dynamicists. It's a waste of time. They're taught their techniques. They've got their fame doing that. They're not going to change. It's not a leverage point. You know, you gotta talk to the right economist, but you got to talk to the public and the business community. I think Jay was ultimately correct on that. He said, I never write for fellow academics. He said, are you kidding me? This is useless. I write for the public and the business community. So anyway, okay, so there you go. Like I said, hope you find value in this. Stop me if I'm going off and you say, really, we don't need to. That's fine by me. I try and make it interesting as well as we'll get more technically detailed as we go along, like how do you do it? But anyway, so we'll leave it there. Same time next week.
All right. Thank you.
Have a good one.
Yeah.
You too. Have a nice
Have
week.
Have a nice week.
All right, we'll see y'all.